Please pray with me. God of relationship, may we listen for the ways that you draw us closer together. Help us to remember that we as your people are bone of each other's bone and flesh of each other's flesh. May we remember that we belong together. Amen. This morning's text is a challenging one. From Genesis, we hear one of the creation stories. Not everyone realizes that there are actually two in the book of Genesis. The first creation story happens at the very beginning, Genesis 1, and it's the more poetic version when God is saying he created something and then it was good, and then it was the next day. And there are 7 of those days. And then in Genesis 2, it jumps into our second creation story, and it's the story that recounts the tales of Adam and Eve. My favorite part of the story of Adam and Eve is actually the fact that Adam in Hebrew doesn't necessarily mean male. It's an androgynous term. It's the word for dirt. That Adam is actually dirt, a human made from the ground. And it's not a male word in Hebrew. And God sees this one human and decides this human needs a partner. This person needs someone to be there with them. And so God sends Adam, this human, to sleep. And then in the scripture, it's often translated as the word rib. But another translation of the word for rib is half. So God takes half of that one human and creates 2. And as they wake up, they become bone of each other's bone, flesh of each other's flesh. One is male and one is female. We have then Adam and Eve. And so there's this story of these 2 beings who are created from each other. That God created them to be in partnership and in relationship. And then we jump to our gospel text this morning, which can also be a very troubling text for many people. In this gospel, some men come to test Jesus on the law. This happens throughout our gospel text, that Jesus is tested by people. And so these men come to test Jesus, and they ask him about Moses' law, about divorce. And Jesus reminds them it's not about what is legal. It's about what God calls us to, and God calls us to a just and healthy relationship of belonging to each other. It's about love. It's the fact that you were created to be in relationship, to belong to one another. This text has often been misused to condemn divorce. I personally believe that Jesus would not want someone to stay in a marriage or a relationship when they were extremely unhappy, if they were being abused or harmed in any way. I don't believe that Jesus would call you to stay in it. No, what Jesus is saying in this particular context, if you listen to the words of the scriptures, he says, a man cannot divorce a woman and cast her out. So in Jesus' time, a Hebrew woman, a Jewish woman, was not allowed to ask for divorce. Only a man was allowed to do that. A man had power, complete power over the woman. She was considered property. And what would happen is if a man asked for a divorce from a woman, she was cast out. A woman was not allowed to have property of her own. And so she would then become homeless. So for Jesus, it was a justice issue. You cannot just cast someone out to have nothing. He says, remember you belong to each other. To honor that relationship, to honor the fact that you are bone of each other's bone, flesh of each other's flesh. He was to remember that that is God's purpose for us. As I thought about this text for World Communion Sunday, I kept thinking about God's family and God's table. Often around the holidays, we gather as families around large tables. And so this seemed particularly poignant as we go into the time of Thanksgiving and Christmas, when you are called to sit with those people in your families you don't always want to sit with. It's a great reminder that we belong to each other. But this text, being reminded that we are bone of each other's bone, I thought about belonging to God's table and how at God's table, historically, we as humans have silenced many voices. Or we've talked so loud that other voices have been turned out or told that they're not worthy of being heard. While I want to say and believe that there is room for every single voice at the table, I do believe that Jesus wouldn't be afraid to tell some people, be quiet. I think he would tell some people, you have talked long enough. When we trace through the Gospels, we hear Jesus doing this repeatedly. He says this to the people in power. He says this to the people who are oppressing others. Jesus is always standing on the side of those who have been silenced, on the side of those who have been oppressed. He lifts up those voices. When Jesus first begins his ministry, he goes to his hometown and stands up in the temple and he grabs the scroll of Isaiah. And he reads this. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he sits and says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And I can just imagine it now. The person who raises their hand, well, what about me? You didn't listen to me. But Jesus, he also says in the Gospel of Mark, which we heard from this morning, he says, it is not the healthy who need the doctor, but the sick. I'm not depriving the healthy of anything. I'm coming for the sick. He says, I come to bring good news to the poor, not because the rich don't need good news, but because the poor really need it. The rich have had good news their whole life. It is the poor who need that proclamation of good news. It is the prisoner who needs to be set free. The oppressed are the ones who need to be set free. And so at God's table, it's not that one person takes another person's seat. No, at God's table, all are welcome. And it is the one who has been oppressed that gets the seat of honor. Jesus is all about centering those who have been left out and marginalized, not to cast anyone else out, but to bring in and draw in those who have been left out. So when I think about Jesus, I wonder, how can we apply this today? Who is Jesus calling us to center in our world today? Whose voices is Jesus calling us to lift up? God's table is a place of abundance. It's not that some get all and others get none. It's not about that full reversal. It's that everyone has enough. There's enough for everyone. But Jesus is there calling forth those who have been left out. And we can trust that at God's table, those who have been silenced, it is their voices who will be lifted up. Those who have been left with little will be given plenty. And those who have been oppressed, again, will be given the seat of honor. in this gospel text, Jesus closes with a discussion with his disciples. He's sitting there talking to them, and all of a sudden, some young children come running up. And the disciples try to shoo them away, keeping them from Jesus, as if they're trying to protect Jesus' time, to save his time for something more important, like ministry to the adults. And Jesus becomes indignant. That's the word in our scripture. He becomes indignant and says, "Let the little children come to me." Jesus is calling the children forth. Children were historically left out. They were less than. And Jesus says, "Let them come to me." He draws them and he takes them in his arms. And with this, what he's doing, he's reversing the hierarchy of the status quo. When he talked about divorce, he reverses the status quo in which men are over women. He levels them out. He reverses the status quo of adults being more important than children. He says, no, they are just as important. He says, the poor are just as important as the rich. And Jesus draws them in. All these people that have been left out, he draws them in. So we must ask ourselves, as we come to our communion table, when we are the body of Christ, when we are called to be God's hands and feet and heart in the world, whose voices have been silenced and whose voices do we need to lift up? Who has been left out? How can we draw them in?